important aspect of any teaching program, even if you've got only a couple of students, is assessments. It's important to make sure that you've set your assessments beforehand, or at least have a reasonable idea of where you want students to be at the end of your program or at the end of the term and or so forth. Two important types of assessments, and they do overlap: diagnostic and formative. Formative just means looking at students, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and saying, well, Johnny's doing quite well, we'll expand on what he's doing and make it a little bit more tricky. Or Johnny's not doing too well, we've got to go back to basis. That's what formative assessment's all about. It's sort of done on a rolling basis, I guess. Diagnostic is, think of like going to the doctors and being diagnosed. NAPLAN test, your exams, university exams, any of those end of period, end of program, or maybe even mid-program, to see where students are up to and to gauge their progress so far. Important things to remember with assessments. Firstly, your assessment should always be a learning tool. They're not an end of program and that's it and be on it all. You've learnt everything, then you do your assessment, then you move on. Your assessments should be another way, another tool for students to continue to develop their skills and knowledge on top of what they already know. Self-esteem and achievement. The most important thing with assessment is not to set something that is totally unachievable, because we want them to be successful, within reason of course. So we want students to achieve, to reach a certain goal. If they're going to get 80%, they're going to feel good about the subject. They're more likely to perform well in the future. They're more likely to do homework. They're more likely to participate. And which, of course, we know students with high self-esteem work harder, are more focused, and generally don't misbehave. And even students that have low self-esteem in certain subjects, like mathematics, for example, who have high self-esteem in another subject, take, say, English or sport, and they'll concentrate harder and work better in those subjects. So using assessments to develop self-esteem and how that relates to achievement is really, really important. Competency. Another interesting point about assessments is maybe you're using it to judge a competency, which is what the vocational sector is all about. For example, your Certificate 3s, judging whether a student is competent at a particular task before they move on to something that's a bit more difficult or more complex, for example. Competition is another important aspect of assessments. You can use competition, especially with boys, as a way of trying to improve your assessment results, as a way of getting them to do extra work, to do extra study. Remember with competition that it's got to be done right, it's got to be in a positive support type of way, it's got to be a very well structured, and it's got to be properly done so that people don't think they're failing. But competition can be brilliant, especially if you've got groups or pairs, for example, trying to better other people's scores. Assessments don't have to be serious, they don't have to be pen and paper. Assessments can be fun, assessments can be practical, or even a combination of both. And validity. Finally, the last thing, making sure, for example, that what you're actually trying to assess is what you're assessing. And I'll give you an example of that. In one of my Year 9 classes, we found that a lot of the male students who did really poorly actually knew the answers to the questions if we presented the mathematical question simply with numbers. But as soon as we put words and I make it a worded question, for example, if you drive 50 k's in your car and blah 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 blah, how long does it take to get from this? That would really confuse them, because their literacy skills are often quite very poor, or their comprehension skills are quite poor. So in that case, that wouldn't really be a valid question, because we're in a way assessing their literacy, not necessarily assessing their numeracy skills. In that case, you could argue that, well, we're assessing problem solving. Okay, so it's interesting to think about assessments and to think about why we set them and the point of setting them. Not only setting them specifically because you think you have to, because that's what's happened in the past and people always need to be assessed. The reasons why we do it. Think about, do you even need to do an assessment? Have you been assessing students throughout your program or throughout the year or throughout the term? Maybe you already know exactly where they're up to. Maybe you already know that they're competent at certain things, so there's no point in having a stressful exam at the end of the term, for example.